Legends and warnings about bear attacks echo across cultures, reminding us how fragile the line between safety and chaos truly is. These massive predators strike without hesitation, leaving devastation in their wake and survivors forever changed. From a polar bear charging a helicopter crew on Greenland's icy coast to a black bear crashing a backyard party in North Carolina, no place is truly safe. In this video, we'll explore 6 chilling real-life encounters with bears, each more terrifying than the last, unfolding in both wilderness and urban settings. The dense forests of Ussuri Krai stretched endlessly across the remote eastern frontier of Russia, a wilderness where ancient taiga met the occasional whisper of civilization. In August 2025, this rugged landscape bore witness to one of the most devastating wildlife encounters in the region's recorded history. The area, known for its pristine biodiversity and rare botanical specimens, had become increasingly popular among eco-tourists seeking to photograph exotic plant life that thrived in the temperate climate zone where Siberian and subtropical ecosystems converged. Yelena Morozova had been guiding wildlife expeditions through these forests for over 15 years. Her reputation as a knowledgeable and safety-conscious guide had earned her steady work with international tour groups, particularly those interested in documenting the region's unique flora and fauna. On August 7th, she led a group of 15 enthusiastic tourists, mostly photographers and botanists from various European countries, deep into a section of forest known for its rare orchid varieties and unusual fern species. The morning had started promisingly. The group had already captured stunning images of several rare plant specimens, and the atmosphere was lighthearted as they trekked along a narrow game trail. The tourists, equipped with professional cameras and field notebooks, chattered excitedly about their discoveries. Among them was Dmitry Volkov, an amateur photographer from Moscow, who had joined the expedition in hopes of adding some adventure to his portfolio. Around midday, as the group paused near a clearing to document a cluster of unusual mushrooms, Dmitry noticed a small flock of crows perched in the nearby trees. In what he later described to investigators as a moment of innocent amusement, he decided to entertain his fellow tourists by feeding the birds. He pulled out a small bag of breadcrumbs he had saved from breakfast, crumpling the paper wrapper and tossing pieces toward the expectant corvids. What Dmitry had not realized was that the bag had previously contained dried fish snacks he had purchased at a market in Vladivostok. The wrapper retained traces of the pungent scent, and as he crumpled and discarded it, the aroma began to drift through the forest air. The innocent gesture of feeding crows had inadvertently created a scent trail that would prove catastrophic. Yelena had been examining a rare species of wild ginger when she heard the first rustling from a nearby thicket. Her years of experience in these forests had taught her to distinguish between the sounds of small wildlife and something far more dangerous. The heavy, deliberate movement through the underbrush immediately set off alarm bells in her mind. She looked up from her botanical examination and quickly scanned the tree line, her hand instinctively moving toward the emergency flare gun at her belt. The massive male Russian grizzly emerged from the dense vegetation with terrifying suddenness. Standing nearly 3 meters tall when it reared on its hind legs, the bear displayed the characteristic brown fur and imposing bulk that made these creatures among the most formidable predators in the region. Its sensitive nose had detected the fish scent from a considerable distance, and the combination of the smell and the unfamiliar human sounds had triggered its aggressive response. The attack began with brutal efficiency. The bear charged directly toward the clustered group of tourists, who had been focused on their photography and completely unaware of the approaching danger. 3 tourists standing closest to the thicket had no time to react before the massive animal slammed into them with the force of a small vehicle. The impact sent them crashing into the trunk of a large birch tree, their cameras and equipment scattering across the forest floor. The bear's claws, each as long as a human finger and razor sharp, tore through clothing and flesh with horrifying ease. Deep gashes opened across torsos and limbs as the animal's powerful swipes connected with human targets. The victim's screams echoed through the forest as the bear's attack continued with relentless intensity. Two more tourists, who had attempted to flee toward a fallen log, found themselves trapped as the bear's massive frame rolled over them. The animal's weight, exceeding 300 kilograms, crushed ribs and broke bones with sickening cracks that could be heard above the chaos. Its powerful jaws clamped down on shoulders and arms, the pressure of its bite causing devastating injuries to bone and tissue. Yelena watched in horror as the remaining members of the group scattered in different directions, their panic making coordinated escape impossible. The bear, now fully engaged in its attack, lunged at the fleeing tourists with surprising speed for such a large animal. It knocked several people to the ground and continued its mauling, its predatory instincts fully activated by the scent, movement, and sounds of distressed humans. The forest filled with the sounds of terror as the bear systematically attacked one victim after another. Some tourists attempted to climb trees, but the bear's reach and agility made escape nearly impossible. Others tried to use their camera equipment as shields, but the animal's strength rendered such defenses useless. In desperation, Yelena drew her emergency flare gun and fired a bright red signal flare into the canopy above. The sudden burst of light and the sharp crack of the flare's ignition startled the bear momentarily, causing it to pause in its attack. The brief distraction allowed the 6 surviving tourists to scramble toward thicker vegetation where they could hide. When rescue teams finally reached the scene hours later, they discovered 9 tourists had been fatally mauled. The survivors, though severely injured with deep lacerations, broken bones, and facial wounds from the bear's claws, provided detailed accounts of how a simple act of feeding birds had triggered the deadly encounter. The incident served as a stark reminder that in the wilderness, even the smallest human actions could have catastrophic consequences when they intersected with the territorial instincts of apex predators. The rolling hills surrounding Asheville, North Carolina, have long been renowned for their scenic beauty and diverse wildlife. By June 2025, suburban development had pushed deeper into traditional bear habitats, creating an increasingly precarious balance between human settlement and wild animal territories. The area's black bear population had adapted to human presence over the decades, often venturing into residential neighborhoods in search of easily accessible food sources. Havilah Rourke had purchased her mountain home specifically for its panoramic views and proximity to nature. The property, situated on 3 acres of partially wooded land, provided the perfect setting for outdoor entertaining. Her cedar deck overlooked a natural ravine where deer frequently grazed, and she had installed motion-activated lights to deter any unwanted nocturnal visitors. Despite warnings from local wildlife officials about proper food storage, many residents in the area had grown complacent about bear encounters. On the evening of June 28th, Havilah hosted what she had planned as a casual summer gathering for 25 friends and neighbors. The party began at sunset, with guests arriving to find grilled burgers, corn on the cob, and various side dishes arranged across several folding tables on the deck. Coolers filled with ice and beverages lined the deck's perimeter, and the warm evening air carried the inviting aromas of barbecued meat and spilled beer across the surrounding forest. As darkness settled over the mountains, portable speakers provided background music while guests mingled between the deck and the adjacent lawn area. The festive atmosphere masked the subtle sounds of movement in the nearby tree line, where the concentrated odors of food had drawn a large male black bear. The animal, weighing approximately 180 kilograms, had been foraging in the area for several weeks, as natural food sources became scarcer due to an unusually dry spring. The bear initially approached with caution, remaining hidden in the shadows beyond the deck's lighting. However, the combination of meat smells, fermented beverage odors, and human voices triggered its curiosity rather than its natural avoidance instincts. Years of successful raids on garbage cans and bird feeders had conditioned the animal to associate human activity with readily available calories. Around 10:30, as guests were beginning to clean up the evening's leftovers, The bear emerged from the tree line and ambled directly toward the deck. Its massive frame became visible in the outdoor lighting, causing initial nervous laughter among the partygoers, who assumed the animal would retreat once it realized humans were present. Several guests reached for their phones to capture what they believed would be an amusing wildlife encounter. The bear's behavior, however, quickly shifted from curious exploration to determined feeding. It approached one of the coolers that had been knocked over during the party, spilling beer and melted ice across the deck's wooden planks. When Marcus Chen, one of the guests, attempted to shoo the animal away by waving a folding chair, the bear's demeanor changed dramatically. The bear charged with surprising speed, covering the distance between the cooler and Marcus in less than 3 seconds. Its powerful forelegs struck him in the chest, sending him tumbling backward into a glass-topped patio table that shattered on impact. The sudden violence transformed the gathering from a pleasant social event into a scene of absolute terror. Havala, who had been collecting empty plates near the grill, found herself directly in the bear's path as it continued its aggressive advance. The animal knocked her to the deck's wooden surface with a devastating blow that sent sharp pain shooting through her shoulder and back. The bear's weight, as it pressed down on her prone form, made breathing nearly impossible, while its claws raked across her arms and back, tearing through her summer dress and opening deep lacerations in her skin. Panic erupted among the remaining guests as they scrambled toward the house's sliding doors. Some threw whatever objects they could find, plastic cups, serving utensils, and decorative items, while others retreated to upper-floor windows, from which they hurled pots and pans in desperate attempts to drive off the attacking animal. The cacophony of screaming voices, clattering objects, and the bear's vocalizations created a chaos that seemed to agitate the already aggressive animal further. The bear turned its attention to 2 other guests, who had been too slow to reach safety. It mauled both individuals with swift, powerful strikes that left them with broken ribs, punctured skin, and severe bruising. The animal's focus then shifted to a large cooler that had remained intact, and it seized the container in its powerful jaws before beginning to retreat toward the forest edge. As emergency sirens wailed in the distance, the bear disappeared into the darkness with its prize, leaving behind a deck littered with broken furniture, scattered food, and bloodstains. Havala survived her injuries after receiving treatment for deep lacerations and a fractured collarbone, while the other victims required surgery for their wounds. The incident became a stark reminder to the mountain community that their suburban paradise remained part of a larger wilderness ecosystem where apex predators followed ancient patterns that human development could not easily override. Wyoming's Wind River Range had earned its reputation as one of America's most challenging and pristine wilderness areas. The rugged mountain terrain, stretching across over 1 million acres of high-altitude forests and alpine meadows, provided habitat for some of the continent's most formidable wildlife. In October 2023, these ancient peaks would test the survival skills of even the most experienced outdoors people when weather and predators combined in a deadly encounter. Torrin Calloway had spent 32 years hunting elk across the American West, building a reputation among his peers for his ability to track game through the most difficult terrain. His experience in the Wind River Range spanned over a decade, and he was well acquainted with the area's unpredictable weather patterns and the behavioral habits of its resident grizzly bear population. The region's elevation changes and dense forest coverage created perfect conditions for both elk herds and the massive predators that hunted them. On October 15th, Torrin had been tracking a large bull elk for 3 days through increasingly treacherous mountain terrain. The animal's trail led him deep into a remote valley system where few hunters ventured, following game paths that wound between towering pine trees and across steep rocky slopes. Weather reports had predicted possible afternoon thunderstorms, but the morning had dawned clear and cold, encouraging him to continue his pursuit. By early afternoon, dark clouds began to gather over the highest peaks, and the first rumblings of thunder echoed across the mountainous landscape. Torin realized that the elk he had been tracking was likely seeking shelter in the same areas where other wildlife congregated during severe weather. His decades of hunting experience had taught him that storms often concentrated both predators and prey in predictable locations. The lightning storm struck with the sudden intensity characteristic of high-altitude weather systems. Thunder crashed overhead with deafening force, while brilliant flashes illuminated the darkening forest in stark, momentary detail. Heavy raindrops began pelting through the forest canopy, quickly soaking through Torin's hunting gear and reducing visibility to mere meters in any direction. As he navigated a steep slope covered with loose rock and fallen logs, Torin discovered fresh elk tracks in the muddy soil. The deep impressions indicated that a large animal had passed through the area within the previous hour, possibly seeking shelter from the intensifying storm. He adjusted his rifle's position and began following the trail with increased caution, aware that the combination of reduced visibility and wet conditions made every step potentially dangerous. The grizzly bear appeared without warning from a rocky outcropping above the game trail. The massive animal, disoriented by the thunder and lightning, had been pursuing the same elk when it encountered the human intruder in its territory. Standing nearly 3 meters tall when it reared on its hind legs, the bear displayed the characteristic shoulder hump and broad head that identified it as a mature male specimen weighing well over 300 kilograms. Torin's rifle, a dependable bolt-action model he had carried for years, jammed when he attempted to chamber a round. The combination of moisture and debris from his arduous trek had compromised the weapon's mechanism at the critical moment when his survival depended on its function. The bear charged down the slope with terrifying speed, its powerful legs propelling its massive frame across the treacherous terrain with surprising agility. The impact sent Torin tumbling across the rocky ground, his rifle flying from his grasp as the bear's claws raked across his back and shoulders. The animal's weight crushed him against the wet stone surface, while its razor-sharp claws tore through his hunting jacket and opened deep gashes in his flesh. Pain shot through his body as the bear's massive paws struck his shoulder, partially dislocating the joint and sending waves of agony down his arm. Lightning continued to flash overhead, creating stroboscopic glimpses of the attack as Torin struggled beneath the bear's crushing weight. He managed to push against the animal's chest with his uninjured arm, creating enough space to roll partially away from its claws. The bear's confusion from the storm worked in his favor, as the thunder and lightning seemed to distract the animal from delivering a killing blow. Blood soaked through Torin's sleeve and mixed with the rainwater streaming down his face from a cut above his left eye. The wound partially obscured his vision, but adrenaline gave him the strength to scramble across the jagged rocks toward a cluster of fallen trees. Each movement sent sharp pain through his injured shoulder and back, while the storm's intensity made every step treacherous on the slick rock surfaces. The bear circled the area for several minutes, its massive form visible in the lightning flashes as it investigated the scent trail and blood that marked Torin's escape route. Eventually, the combination of the storm's intensity and the lack of immediate threat caused the animal to retreat deeper into the forest, leaving Torin alone with his injuries in the continuing tempest. Hours later, as the storm finally subsided, Torin managed to flag down a Forest Service ranger on a distant trail. His survival became a testament to human endurance and the importance of remaining calm when confronted by the raw power of nature's apex predators under extreme conditions. Alaska's Kodiak Island had maintained its reputation as home to the world's largest brown bears for centuries before commercial fishing operations established permanent facilities along its rugged coastlines. By March 2022, several remote lodges provided services to fishing vessels operating in the nutrient-rich waters surrounding the island. These facilities, often staffed by only a handful of employees during off-season periods, were situated near a bear population that viewed human settlements as potential sources of easy calories. Officer Marla Dennison had accepted a temporary assignment at one of these isolated fishing lodges after completing her law enforcement training in Anchorage. The facility, located on a sheltered bay accessible only by boat or seaplane, served as both a processing station for commercial catches and an administrative office for documenting fishing activities in the region. The lodge's remote location meant that staff members needed to be prepared for wildlife encounters, though serious incidents had been rare in previous years. The morning of March 18th began with routine administrative tasks as Marla reviewed fishing reports and permit documentation in the lodge's main office. The building, constructed from heavy timber and designed to withstand harsh weather conditions, featured large windows that provided panoramic views of the surrounding wilderness. Outside, several pallets of fish shipments awaited transport to processing facilities on the mainland, their storage creating an aromatic beacon that could attract wildlife from considerable distances. Kodiak bears, capable of reaching weights exceeding 600 kilograms, possess sensory capabilities that enabled them to detect food sources from great distances. The massive male bear that approached the lodge that morning represented the apex of predatory evolution, combining immense physical power with intelligence and adaptability that had allowed the species to thrive in Alaska's harsh environment for millennia. The improperly secured fish shipments outside the lodge had been creating scent trails for several days, but staff members had grown complacent about proper storage protocols during the slow season. The bear had been investigating the area's perimeter for hours before finally approaching the building directly, drawn by the concentrated fish odors that emanated from both the outdoor pallets and the processing equipment inside. Marla was organizing permit files when the first sounds of splintering wood announced the bear's arrival. The animal had chosen to enter through the lodge's sliding glass door, which offered less resistance than the heavy timber construction of the main entrance. The impact of 600 kilograms of muscle and bone against the glass barrier created an explosion of fragments and twisted metal framework, sending office furniture tumbling across the room. Papers and documents scattered through the air as the massive bear barreled into the confined space of the office area. Filing cabinets toppled over with resounding crashes, while the animal's bulk swept aside chairs and desks as it searched for the source of the fish scents that had drawn it to the building. The bear's presence transformed the orderly office environment into chaos within seconds of its violent entry. Marla attempted to retreat toward the building's rear exit, but the bear's speed and the confined space made escape impossible. The animal slammed into her with tremendous force, sending her crashing into a heavy wooden desk that partially collapsed under the impact. The bear's massive claws raked across her arms and chest, opening deep lacerations while the crushing weight of its body pressed down on her ribcage with bone-breaking pressure. The sensation of her ribs cracking under the bear's weight was accompanied by sharp pain that indicated a punctured lung, making breathing increasingly difficult as the attack continued. Blood began to fill her mouth while the bear's claws continued to tear through her clothing and flesh, leaving parallel gashes that would require extensive surgical repair if she survived the encounter. Other lodge staff members, hearing the commotion from adjacent buildings, began throwing whatever objects they could find through the office windows in desperate attempts to distract the attacking animal. The bear turned its attention to the source of these new disturbances, using its powerful frame to toss filing cabinets and shred important documents as it investigated the perceived threats from outside. In a moment of desperate inspiration, Marla spotted an emergency flare gun mounted on the office wall and managed to reach the device, despite her severe injuries. She fired the bright red flare directly at the ceiling above the bear's head, creating a burst of light and sound that startled the massive predator. The flare's ignition filled the enclosed space with brilliant illumination and acrid smoke, causing the bear to hesitate in its destructive rampage. The bear's confusion provided enough of a distraction for it to retreat through the destroyed sliding door and disappear into the surrounding forest. Marla survived after emergency surgery performed by medical personnel flown in by helicopter, though the lodge suffered extensive damage that required months of reconstruction. The incident highlighted the importance of adhering to proper food storage protocols in areas where human activities overlap with those of apex predators. Cluj-Napoca, Romania's second-largest city, has hosted traveling circuses for over a century, thanks to its central location in Transylvania, which makes it a traditional stop for European entertainment troupes. By September 2024, public attitudes toward animal performances had begun shifting across Europe, but several conventional circuses continued to feature wild animal acts, despite growing controversy. The region's history with brown bears, dating back to medieval times when the animals roamed freely through Carpathian forests, added cultural significance to performances featuring these powerful predators. Daniela Ionescu had worked as an animal trainer for 8 years, specializing in European brown bear performances that combined traditional circus entertainment with educational demonstrations about wildlife conservation. Her experience with the temperamental animals had taught her to recognize subtle behavioral cues that indicated stress or agitation. However, the circus environment often made it difficult to maintain optimal conditions for wild animal performers. The traveling circus had arrived in Cluj-Napoca 3 days before the September 14th performance, setting up their elaborate tent structure in a field on the city's outskirts. The brown bear featured in Daniela's act was a 7-year-old male named Karpati, weighing approximately 280 kilograms and standing nearly 2 meters tall when upright. The animal had been performing circus routines for 4 years, though recent rehearsals had shown signs of increasing stress as the bear matured and its instincts became more pronounced. Preparation for the evening show began several hours before the scheduled performance time, with various acts rehearsing their routines while technical crews tested lighting and sound equipment. The circus tent's interior buzzed with activity as performers practiced their acts under the bright spotlights that would illuminate the evening's entertainment. The cacophony of different acts rehearsing simultaneously created a sensory overload that affected both human performers and the captive animals. Daniela had been working with Karpati in the practice ring when the technical crew began testing the evening's light show. Brilliant spotlights flashed in rapid succession, while speakers blared music from multiple acts, creating an overwhelming sensory assault that would have challenged even the most experienced performers. The bear, already stressed by the unfamiliar surroundings and disrupted routine, began showing signs of agitation through pacing and vocalizations. The breaking point came when another act's rehearsal produced the sharp crack of a whip being tested for an equestrian performance. The sudden sound, combined with a particularly bright burst of strobe lighting, triggered an explosive reaction from the already agitated bear. The animal's chain, designed to provide security during controlled performances, snapped under the sudden stress of 280 kilograms of panicked muscle and bone. Karpati lunged directly at Daniela with the full force of his considerable weight and power. The impact sent her crashing to the sawdust-covered floor, while the bear's claws tore across her chest and thigh, opening wounds that immediately began bleeding profusely. The sound of breaking bones was audible above the circus noise as the bear's weight pressed down on her smaller human frame. Stagehands and other performers reacted with a mixture of panic and desperate courage. Some fled toward the tent's exits, while others grabbed whatever makeshift weapons they could find: metal tent stakes, wooden practice equipment, and folding chairs, to drive off the attacking animal. Their shouting and the clatter of improvised weapons only added to the chaos that had triggered the bear's aggressive response. Children who had arrived early with their parents for the evening show witnessed the attack from the spectator seating area, their screams adding another layer of terror to an already nightmarish situation. Parents covered their children's eyes, while others called emergency services on their mobile phones, though the remote location meant that professional help would be delayed. The bear dragged Daniela several meters across the practice ring before circus workers managed to surround the animal with fire extinguishers and metal barriers. The concentrated spray from multiple extinguishers, combined with the coordinated efforts of several handlers armed with restraint equipment, finally forced Karpati to release his victim and retreat to a corner of the ring where emergency tranquilizer equipment could be deployed. Daniela survived after undergoing intensive surgery to repair damage to her chest and leg, though her injuries ended her career as an animal trainer. The attack reignited long-standing debates across Europe about the ethics and safety of using wild animals in entertainment, with several countries subsequently implementing stricter regulations on circus performances involving wild animals. The incident demonstrated how the artificial environment of a circus, with its bright lights, loud noises, and confined spaces, could overwhelm even well-trained wild animals, triggering violent responses that endangered both performers and spectators. Karpati was retired from performance and relocated to a wildlife sanctuary where he could live in conditions more suited to his natural behavioral needs. Greenland's eastern coastline represents one of Earth's most isolated and challenging environments, where Arctic conditions persist year-round and human presence remains minimal, except for essential research and supply operations. By March 2023, climate change had begun altering traditional polar bear hunting patterns, forcing these apex predators to range further from their usual territories in search of adequate prey. The combination of changing ice conditions and increased human activity in previously untouched regions created unprecedented potential for dangerous encounters. Captain Ingrid Solheim had piloted supply helicopters across Arctic regions for 12 years, building expertise in the extreme weather conditions and logistical challenges that defined polar aviation. Her experience included hundreds of landings at remote research stations, weather monitoring facilities, and emergency supply drops, where precision flying meant the difference between successful missions and catastrophic equipment loss in one of the world's most unforgiving environments. The March 4th supply run to a remote weather monitoring station had been planned for weeks, with careful attention paid to weather patterns and fuel calculations required for the round-trip journey. The outpost, located on Greenland's coast approximately 400 kilometers from the nearest permanent settlement, relied entirely on helicopter deliveries for food, fuel, and essential equipment during the harsh winter months when ice conditions made sea transport impossible. Ingrid's helicopter carried critical supplies, including heating fuel drums, emergency medical equipment, and food provisions that would sustain the three-person research team through the remainder of winter. The cargo also included frozen food supplies stored in insulated crates that, unknown to the crew, would prove fatally attractive to the massive polar bear that had been hunting in the area. The landing zone consisted of a cleared area adjacent to the research station's main buildings, marked by reflective posts that remained visible even during severe weather conditions. Ice ridges and pressure formations surrounded the facility, creating a landscape of frozen barriers that could conceal wildlife until they approached within dangerous proximity of human activities. As Ingrid's helicopter descended toward the landing zone, its rotor wash created swirling clouds of snow and ice crystals that reduced visibility and masked natural sounds from the surrounding environment. The crew had become focused on the technical demands of landing safely on the uneven ice surface while managing the cargo's weight distribution to prevent the aircraft from tipping during the unloading process. The massive polar bear, weighing over 400 kilograms and standing nearly 3 meters tall when upright, had been attracted to the landing site by the scent of the frozen food supplies. The animal had been stalking the area from behind ice ridges that provided perfect camouflage against the white landscape. The helicopter's arrival, with its mechanical noise and downward air blast, triggered a predatory response rather than the expected flight reaction. As the rotors began to slow and crew members started unloading fuel drums, the polar bear emerged from its concealment and charged toward the aircraft. The animal's powerful legs propelled its massive frame across the ice with surprising speed, covering the distance to the helicopter in seconds. Instead of being deterred by the still rotating blades and mechanical noise, the bear seemed driven to frenzy by the combination of food scents and territorial intrusion. The bear's first target was Eriki Haugen, a helicopter mechanic who had stepped away from the aircraft to secure fuel drums against wind displacement. The animal knocked him to the ice surface with devastating force, its massive paws striking with enough power to fracture ribs and cause internal injuries. The mechanic's survival gear provided some protection, but the bear's claws still managed to tear through multiple layers of Arctic clothing. Ingrid leaped from the pilot's seat in an attempt to rescue her crew member, but the bear immediately turned its attention to this new threat. Its claws slashed across her thigh and ribs, tearing through her flight suit and opening wounds that immediately began bleeding into the sub-zero air. The bear's hot breath created clouds of steam as it pressed its attack, its predatory instincts fully engaged despite the chaotic environment of the helicopter landing zone. Crew members who remained near the aircraft began hurling tools, spare parts, and any available objects at the attacking bear while shouting to distract the animal from its victims. Several emergency flare pistols were fired into the air, creating bright bursts of light and sound that competed with the mechanical noise from the helicopter's engine and rotor systems. The helicopter's downwash continued to create blinding swirls of snow and ice particles, making coordinated defense difficult, while the bear maintained its aggressive assault. For several minutes, the landing zone became a scene of desperate survival as human technology confronted one of nature's most powerful predators on its home territory. Eventually, the combined effect of flares, thrown objects, and the helicopter's mechanical disturbance caused the polar bear to retreat toward the ice ridges from which it had emerged. However, the animal did not disappear entirely. Instead, it pit itself approximately 50 meters from the landing zone, where it continued to observe human activity with predatory interest. The research station's emergency protocols had been activated the moment the attack began, with Dr. Sarah Christofferson and her two colleagues barricading themselves inside the main facility while monitoring the situation through reinforced windows. The station's radio equipment allowed them to maintain contact with rescue coordination centers. Still, the remote location meant that emergency medical assistance would require hours to arrive under optimal weather conditions. Ingrid's injuries proved more severe than initially apparent as adrenaline began to subside and shock set in. The polar bear's claws had penetrated deep enough to cause significant muscle damage in her thigh, while the wounds along her rib cage had created punctures that threatened to compromise her breathing. Blood loss became a critical concern as the sub-zero temperatures caused her body to work harder to maintain core warmth while simultaneously dealing with trauma. Eric E. Haugen, despite his injuries from the initial bear attack, managed to apply emergency first aid using medical supplies from the helicopter's survival kit. His training in Arctic rescue procedures proved invaluable as he worked to stabilize Ingrid's condition while maintaining constant vigilance for the polar bear's potential return. The mechanic's injuries included 2 fractured ribs and deep bruising across his back and shoulders, but his mobility remained sufficient for him to assist in the emergency response. The helicopter's fuel situation created additional urgency as the extended running time required to maintain rotor readiness had consumed reserves that would be needed for the return journey. Shutting down the aircraft completely would require restart procedures that could prove impossible if the polar bear returned during the vulnerable period when engines were cycling up to operational temperatures. Weather conditions began deteriorating as afternoon temperatures dropped and wind speeds increased, creating ground blizzard conditions that reduced visibility to near zero. The combination of medical emergencies, mechanical concerns, and worsening weather created a survival scenario that tested every aspect of the crew's Arctic training and experience. Dr. Christofferson attempted to provide medical guidance via radio communication, drawing on her wilderness first aid certification to help the helicopter crew manage Ingrid's injuries with limited resources. The research station's medical supplies were too distant and dangerous to retrieve. At the same time, the polar bear remained in the vicinity, forcing the crew to rely entirely on their aircraft's emergency equipment. The bear's continued presence created a psychological element that complicated every decision about movement and resource allocation. Its occasional vocalizations carried across the ice on the Arctic wind, serving as constant reminders that the apex predator had not abandoned its territorial claim to the area around the research facility. Communications with rescue coordination revealed that weather conditions across the region were preventing immediate assistance, with visibility and wind factors grounding other aircraft that might have provided medical evacuation or additional support. The crew faced the possibility of surviving an extended period in hostile conditions while managing serious injuries and potential hypothermia. As darkness began to fall across the Arctic landscape, the challenges multiplied exponentially. The polar bear's natural advantages in cold and darkness would increase significantly, while human visibility and reaction times would be compromised. The helicopter's lights provided some security, but also consumed electrical power that might be needed for critical systems during an extended survival situation. Emergency heating systems on the aircraft became essential for preventing hypothermia in injured crew members, although fuel conservation remained a critical concern for any eventual evacuation attempt. The balance between maintaining life-sustaining warmth and preserving resources for escape created constant tension in decision-making processes. The research station team maintained radio contact throughout the ordeal, providing weather updates, medical guidance, and psychological support for the besieged helicopter crew. Their observations of the polar bear's movements helped track the animal's behavior patterns and provided early warning of any aggressive approaches toward the landing zone. Hours later, as Arctic dawn began to break through the winter darkness, improved weather conditions finally allowed a rescue helicopter to reach the remote outpost. The polar bear had retreated during the night, possibly driven away by the increased human activity and mechanical noise from the prolonged emergency response. Ingrid survived after extensive medical treatment at a specialized Arctic trauma facility, though her injuries required multiple surgeries and months of rehabilitation. The incident became a case study in Arctic survival procedures, highlighting the increasing frequency of human polar bear encounters as climate change altered traditional wildlife patterns and forced these massive predators into closer contact with human activities in previously untouched regions of the Arctic wilderness.